Welcome to episode 2 of Around the Tavern. Today, the guys talk about the history of D&D from the beginning until now. Make sure you don't miss the post-show interview for characters that should have been. And without further ado...
Welcome to Around the Tavern with Chris and Steven. I'm your host, Chris, my co-host, Steven. Steven, how are you doing today?
Great.
I thought you were going to say good there, but I'm glad I transferred into a great. So Around the Tavern is a podcast that covers content from across the Dungeons and Dragons Multiverse from right here in our cozy tavern. Today's topic is Dungeons and Documentaries, the progress and impact of D&D over the years. From Gary Gygax with tactical study rules to Wizards of the Coast. Steven, I've got some real interesting topics for you today.
You know what, Chris? I haven't been in a classroom in over a decade. I can't wait to learn something. I haven't learned something in years.
Well, that's what I'm here to be. I am your teacher. Steven, listeners, you will call me Professor Chris today. Only if you're comfortable with that. So, Steven, let me ask you, what do you know about the origins of D&D?
I know mainly that people were all sorts of hot and nerdy for like tactical war games. I used to be really into Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is, I'm sure, like a distant cousin of those old school, little pewter miniature games. So I know that people really enjoyed those, but then that eventually it sort of transitioned into a hobby where they came up with like fantastical stories to go along with those battles.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea. We would not have Dungeons and Dragons today without war games from the 60s and the 70s. So let's dive into it a little bit. First off, Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, originally designed by Gary Gygax and Dave Aronson. And most people only know Gary. That's because Dave, after, kind of getting the original concept with Gary, was like, hey, I'm not interested in business. So you give me royalties and I'm going to take a step back. So a lot of people only know Gary. And the game was first published in 1974 by TSR. And that's the company that Gary founded with one of his other friends. His other friend made it like 2 years in the company and then he died. So then Gary kind of ran it by himself for a while.
All these guys sounds like they sucked.
Thank you, Stephen. Mind your manners at your desk. And the game was derived from miniature war games with the variation of a game that came out in 1971, Chainmail, which was a game made by Gary, and it kind of served as the initial rule system for Dungeons and Dragons. And here's a neat fact. Dungeons and Dragons, the name was chosen by his 2-year-old daughter, Cindy, at the time. He basically was like, oh, yeah, these are kind of what we're going with. And she goes, actually, I like that one, Dungeons and Dragons. And, it stuck.
Because originally it wasn't going to be like mazes and monsters or something.
Yeah, there's a couple different names there. And, when Gary was making the game, like I said, it started with Chainmail, which was him taking his, war fantasy games and kind of added a twist towards the end that was heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings. And, if you like Dungeons and Dragons, there's a huge parallel to Lord of the Rings because that's what Gary was heavily inspired by. I didn't know if you knew that part, Stephen.
I could guess that was a pretty relevant piece of media in that time.
And, kind of Gary giving birth to Dungeons and Dragons led him down this long road with making his company, leaving the company, and then the company basically going under, being bought out by Wizards of the Coast. And some point in the late 70s is where Gary dipped off and started doing his own thing. But if we're going to go through more of the, progressional history of Dungeons and Dragons, we've got the very first edition, which is referred to as the original Dungeons and Dragons, or OD&D. It was a small book set of 3 little booklets that was published in 1974, and it had a limited budget of only $2,000, and Gary spent about $100 on all the art. And I was telling you this at work the other day. Gary spent $100 on art, so he basically paid people he knew like $1 or $2 per artwork, and the original Dungeons and Dragons like booklets were equivalent to what you would find scribbled on a desk or scribbled in a notebook, with some nudity and monsters that you couldn't really make out what they were supposed to be.
Yeah, they were basically just like black and white, almost like magazines, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they weren't hardcover or anything. All the art looks like they dragged some medieval artist out from the Dark Ages when they didn't know what faces looked like.
Yeah, pretty much. It was like you would look at this and you were questioning whether or not Gary's 4-year-old daughter made it at the time. And it's really hard. I looked for a while. You cannot buy one of these original sets unless you've got a big old wallet, Stephen, which I do not have. But I tried. And then after OD&D, this led to kind of a split in the game where people wanted a more complicated war game with the math, and then they also wanted another version a little bit more simple that people could kind of really get into, and this is what created Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And kind of Advanced D&D, like I've already stated, was like the more complicated version. You had to really know what you're doing to play, and there was a small community that really wanted that. People who were active in the gaming community, especially with war games, that's the level that they wanted. However, people just getting into the game were like, what is going on? What is this? And a lot of people nowadays, if you look back at the earlier editions, you probably would not be able to play it. And I don't know what your experience, Stephen. I don't know if you looked into the earlier editions, and I think you said your first one was 3rd edition, right?
I think 3rd edition, but 3rd edition 3.5, they're so close as far as rules are concerned. It was probably 3.5.
Yeah, 3.5. And that is after Wizards of the Coast came in and was like, hey, look, we're going to redefine a couple little things. Because AD&D came out, that 80s, the height of the satanic panic, everybody was worrying. And they were like, hey, let's try to take some of that real yucky, you can't see me, but I'm doing quotations, real yucky content out.
Well, for me personally, I 100% agree. Half-orcs should not be in the game.
Okay, Stephen, mind your manners. And after, AD&D came out, we're pushing around 1997, and Gary already left the company at this point, and TSR was near broke. They're basically bankrupt, and this is kind of when Wizards of the Coast swooped in, and they're like, hey, let's kind of change the public image. Let's change how everyone sees this. And they spent 3 years developing 3rd edition, which came out in 2000. And, 3rd edition really got a lot of people back into the game and kind of redefined it, made it a little bit more simple. It got rid of the advanced. They just made it one game. But they ran into a problem. Steven, do you know what that problem was?
D&D is for nerds.
Wrong. I mean, not wrong, but not the answer to my question. So the problem that 3rd edition ran into, they kept making content. They made stories, expansions, bloody blah, 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 blah. They kept putting out so much stuff that it broke the game. So they had to fix it. You know what their solution was?
Say it doesn't exist. Let's do it. It's a different one now.
3.5. They basically took the best aspects, again, I'm doing quotations, the best aspects from their opinions and, crumbled it all up. And then bam, 3.5 was born in 2003. Just 3 years after they released the last edition. And to kind of put that into perspective, the first edition came out in 1977, and then the 2nd edition came out in 1989. That's a real big gap between editions. And then just followed by 2000 is when you got 3rd edition. Then 3 years later, 3.5. So it's kind of like shortening the time period between the different editions. And 3.5 was a huge success as far as being in the community goes, players go, getting new people in. And honestly, that's what I learned. I learned 3.5 from a lot of people who taught me Dungeons and Dragons. And I played 3.5 up till about maybe 3 years ago, like we stated in the last episode. And now the forgotten 4th edition, that came out in 2007, just 4 years after 3.5. So you see kind of how the timeline's been sped up from editions, like kind of having 8 to 10 years between editions to just a couple of years. From what I've read, kind of led to the failure of 4th edition. And I've never played 4th because I didn't know it existed. And you know, that sounds silly saying that I jumped from 3.5 to 5 and I didn't know 4th existed. That's because a lot of people push it under the rug.
Numbers are hard, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I barely can read. Why would I know how to do math? And, you know, 4th edition, like I've already said, was kind of a failure. And Wizards of the Coast was like, hey, let's get our stuff together. And that's when they announced in 2012 that they were developing 5th edition, and they had 75,000 playtesters for 5th edition. And the lead developer at the time literally said, hey, this is our chance to get it right. And that led to 5th edition being released in 2014. And 5th edition has, number-wise, has been one of the most popular editions as far as players, merchandise sold, everything. And to kind of put that into perspective, in 2017, 12 million to 15 million players just in North America alone.
Seems like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit. And to kind of put that in perspective, like I said, it was 2017, 12 million people played. And in 1992, the game had just been translated into 14 languages with only about 2 million copies being sold worldwide. So from that, you know, 2nd edition to the transition of 3rd edition, only a couple million people worldwide were playing it. And then bam, 5th edition hits 15 million people in North America alone. That's just kind of a crazy number to me. And then I'd even say, like, recently, especially with how popular D&D has become mainstream, those numbers are probably way, way higher, because the article that I was reading, by article, I mean Wikipedia, it was only dated to 2017, and the year right now is 2022. So those numbers, I'm sure, are a whole lot higher. And kind of getting into more recent news, just recently, it was announced a backwards compatible evolution of 5th edition would be released in 2024 called 1D&D. And that's what they're currently playtesting. I've heard a lot of mixed reviews online. I've not done any of the playtesting, but I've heard very mixed things. A lot of positive, a lot of negative, a lot of in between. So I don't know where to sit on 1D&D yet. But for the most part, that's kind of the chronological order that the editions have been released, and by who released them. Did you enjoy that topic today, Stephen?
Yeah, so it went 1A, 2, 3, 3.5, 4, and then 5.
Yeah, and now we're getting rid of the numbers and going to 1D&D.
Back to the letters again.
And, you know, Gary really was there just for the beginning. He was there to make it, start it, push it, and then he left it in the 70s. And let me just talk a little bit more about Gary, because doing research for this episode, it sent me down a rabbit hole. And, you know, Gary's kind of worshipped in the D&D community for just kind of starting everything. And, you know, there were other people that helped, like Dave and the other guy who started D&D or TSR, but they're kind of forgotten about, because Gary he steals the show, Stephen.
Although it doesn't sound like he really even did that much. He was just there at the beginning.
Well, let me inform you more about Gary Gygax, Stephen. Gary Gygax, or his full name, Ernest Gary Gygax, was born July 27th of 1938, and he passed away March 4th of 2008. He was an American game designer and author, best known for co-creating Dungeons and Dragons with Dave Arneson. He founded the company TSR, with a childhood friend, Don Kay, in 1973. The following year, he and Arnson created D&D. And that's kind of the point when Dave was like, hey, I'm going to step out, but just keep paying me for helping you create it. And Gary was like, hey, that's cool, man. That's cool. I'll agree to that. But this is where kind of the first instance of Gary, I don't want to say kind of being petty or stabbing someone in the back, but that's kind of what he did. When he made a D&D, Advanced D&D, he tried to say it was so different from the original Dungeons and Dragons that Dave shouldn't get any more of the royalties from it. And you know what happened, Steven?
A legal battle ensued.
Dun dun, legal battle. Exactly. Dave took him to court and was like, listen, Gary, it's the same thing. You just changed the rules a little bit. You should still pay me. And Gary was like, no way. And the court was like, Gary, it's the same thing. So guess what? He goes, what? In that exact manner, Stephen. Basically, everybody said what? The court said what? Gary said what? Dave said what? Basically, the court was like, listen, Gary, it's the same thing, so you're going to keep paying Dave. And they settled in March of 1981 with an agreement that Arnson would receive 2.5% royalties on all AD&D products. And this basically gave him a very comfortable 6-figure annual income for the next decade. And he had nothing to do with the company outside of helping Gary start it, And that's isn't that kind of crazy?
Yeah, well, it sounds like Gary maybe played pretty fast and loose with his how he assumed, I guess, copyright and, promising certain things to certain people works.
Yeah, let's just say Gary's business strategy does not work out for him in the end. Although Gary's company was doing really, 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 really well, he wasn't the sole owner. And the other owners within the company basically were running it into the ground. Even though it was a multi-million-dollar company, they were in debt, they were losing money, and Gygax kind of blames the entire financial crisis due to mismanagement by Kevin Bloom, one of the other owners, as like excess inventory, overstaffing, too many company cars, and then some questionable and expensive projects. Like Kevin Bloom, Stephen, he literally spent company money to dig up a 19th century shipwreck.
Sounds like it worked out for Kevin.
Well, yeah, Kevin was just doing whatever he wanted, and Gary's legitimately trying to fund the creative side of the company to kind of expand on details like that. And Kevin's over here buying company cars, hiring too many people, and digging up pirate ships,
God.
And
Damn
Gary,
it, Kevin.
that's what Gary had to say. And, he went to the outside directors and they all agreed that Kevin Bloom should be removed as company president. However, the board honestly saw the company as a terminal failure. They're like, we're so far in the ground. Let's just cut ties and, shut down the company. And Gary was like, no, man, I'm still creating. I've got good ideas. So he uses all of his current wealth to kind of buy everybody else out. And he had just over 50% of the control of the company. And he appointed himself as president and CEO. And he was like, all right, I got to save the company now. Do you know what he did, Stephen?
What year was this?
This was around 1985.
1985. I have no idea what he did. Did he go to Disney World?
Yes, Stephen. To save his company, Gary goes to Disney World. Wrong. So what he did is he basically bet real heavy on one of his new AD&D books, Unearthed Arcana, a compilation of materials that he had been working on for a couple of years, and just was like, hey, all of our effort into this. And it paid off. It worked. He rebuilt the company. He ended up hiring new managers, which would later backfire, but we're not going to dive too far into that aspect right now. And the company starts doing really well again. For now. And then basically the same problems keep happening. Other people get mixed in with the company. Gary's just trying to be creative and expand the brand. Other people are just fumbling around with the money. It's the start of the 80s now. The Satanic Panic. D&D is not as popular as it was, like, in the 70s when it started. And, Gary just keeps struggling, has this power struggle within the company. And he's just like, hey, I'm done. You guys deal with it. And he leaves the company like around 1977. No, that was a lie. And he leaves the company around 1986 over issues with its new majority owner. And this kind of sends Gary off on his own little happy way. He's like, you know what? I did it. I made it. I had the company. I'm going to go do my own thing. And, by this point in the late 80s, Gary's name carried significant weight in the gaming community, whether it was attached to Dungeons and Dragons or not. And do you know any of the other games that Gary made?
I'm guessing he probably remade Chainmail into the ground. Is that true?
No, Chainmail kind of, after he made OD&D, Chainmail was the base supplement for that game. And that was kind of all you ever hear about Chainmail after that, because they kind of revamped their rules for, AD&D and everything after. Oh. So Chainmail is kind of gone by this point.
Did he invent any card games?
Card games? Well, Steven, we could play this guessing game probably for another 30 minutes. So I'm just going to tell you. And I'm going to bring up one of my favorite examples of a game he made after leaving TSR and Dungeons and Dragons, because here's another example of our guy Gary being a little bit petty. Gary, he continued to create role-playing game titles well after leaving TSR, and it began with a multi-genre game he called Dangerous Journeys. Now, this is about 1992, and Dangerous Journeys was a role-playing game created by Gary Gygax, the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons. And the game was originally announced, and this is the best part, Stephen, it was originally announced as Dangerous Dimensions because he wanted it to be abbreviated as D&D.
Yeah, I'm not sure how he thought he could get away with that.
Oh, no, he didn't. TSR shut him down, and they're like, Gary, what are you doing, man? And Gary was like, I'm making my own game. Gary doesn't sound like that, but, he does in this story. And I thought that was just so hilarious because Gary was like, you're going to ruin my company. Well, watch this. And he tries to release a game that would be abbreviated the exact same. But, of course, he lost that in court. They took him and they were basically like, Gary, stop. And Gary changed it to Dangerous Journeys. And I just thought that was such a funny story of Gary being Gary.
Yeah, well, he's a bit of a goofball.
And, Gary continued to, do his own thing after leaving TSR. He made his own, he made kind of like another brand, another company called Gygax Games, and he released a couple titles under that. He has several novels under his belt. He definitely did a wealth of things during his lifetime. And that kind of covers all of what I wanted to mention about Gary Gygax today, with the exception of one more fun fact. Actually, scratch that. I've got two more fun facts for you, Stephen. First fun fact being, in November 1986, Gary Gygax becomes a father again, because the year before, he formed a romantic relationship with his former assistant from TSR and gave birth to his sixth child.
How many children does he end up with?
Six total. It's not a crazy amount, like 30 or something. But I just it was so. I was reading these articles and I'm going down, like looking everything about Gary, and then casually at the end he goes, "Oh yeah, he's been married twice. He had 5 kids with the first wife, and then he got, in an entanglement with his assistant, had another kid, and then he ended up marrying her, or they got married beforehand. I'm not sure the technical part of that, but they got married and they had his 6th kid, which a lot of his kids kind of continue on his legacy now, like working in the company or, creating fantasy game content, which is kind of cool. And now, Steven, I asked you this question before. If you can guess the one thing Gary Gygax has named after him, you'll win. You'll win a prize. Can you guess what it is, Steven? I'm going to give you 3 guesses. 3 guesses, Steven.
All right. All right, pressure's on. The heat is on. What had been named? I'm gonna guess he has a street named after him.
That is not the answer I'm looking for. Here's your second try.
Minor league sports team.
Nope. Wrong. All right, third chance, Steven. This is your third try to, win a prize.
I'm gonna say he has either a monster and a monster manual of some kind or publishing, or maybe a villain of an adventure module.
Okay, so yes, Gygax has things in D&D that's named after him or plays on his name.
However, I win.
That is not the answer I'm looking for.
Oh, okay. It was only one specific right answer, not any right answer.
Well, you weren't 100%, and I'm the teacher here. So, Steven, you did not win the prize today. So let me go ahead and tell you. He has a strain of bacteria named in honor of him. And, I'm probably going to say this wrong, but it's called Atheromia gygaxicana is the strain of bacteria. And if there's any other information on that bacteria, I do not know it.
I'm going to go ahead and say that is not a compliment to have a bacteria named after you.
Steven, are you telling me that you don't want to have bacteria named after you one day?
I'm telling you that whoever named it after him was pranking on him. They were like, right. Man, this Gary guy, he sure did invent Dungeons and Dragons maybe a little bit, but he was a little poopy face, and now he's a disease as well.
A little poopy face.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to clean things up,
Okay, we get it. You don't think being named after a bacteria is cool. I personally would love to be named after a bacteria. You hear that, everybody? If you invent or find a new bacteria and you need to name it after somebody, I call dibs. That's Chris. Chris, Chris. Good thing I know how to spell my own name. So, Steven, that kind of wraps up my fun facts about Gary Gygax. Was there anything that you maybe knew that I didn't touch on?
I mean, I think probably the funnest fact is that Gary was not a good guy. He might have participated in the invention of Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it... Oh, hey, Puffy. Hello, cat. Please, not right now. But I think if it had been in anybody else's hands, who knows what it would look like today, or what the community would be like.
Well, speaking about D&D being in other people's hands, after TSR basically fumbled the ball after Gary left, okay, they were fumbling the ball the whole time, but after the ball finally hit the ground after Gary left, Wizards of the Coast swept in, and they're like, hey, I'm going to buy this company. I'm going to work on rebranding it, and let's redo everything. So imagine this, Stephen. The year is 1997. TSR is absolutely bankrupt. And Wizards of the Coast goes, hey, I'm going to buy it, right? Are you imagining? Are you following me?
I think I'm only like 11 years old. I don't have a very good imagination right now.
Okay, well, that doesn't matter. I'm the teacher. So when Wizards of the Coast swept in, it's not like it was some random company. Wizards of the Coast was started by a lifelong player of Dungeons and Dragons. His name, building up the suspense.
Gooby Gygax.
No, Steven. Gooby Gygax did not start Wizards of the Coast.
So who was this mystery man? This savior.
Savior was Peter Atkinson. And, he'd been playing D&D lifelong, and he actually named Wizards of the Coast after a Wizards Guild from his own campaign that he was playing in. So it's kind of like the company's being saved by a lifelong player who genuinely intended on fixing it. Keyword, he genuinely intended on fixing it. However, the same continuous problem, the company was bought out by new management, leading us to it being a current subsidiary of Hasbro, which they acquired the company in 1999, just 2 years after it purchased TSR. And, they kind of scrapped the whole name TSR. They're like, yeah, we own you guys now, but you're just Wizards of the Coast. And we're gonna start doing things. And that's when they released third edition in 2000 and kind of all the things I already touched on earlier in this episode. But it was kind of really neat to see that, Wizards of the Coast came from somebody who played, and they named their company after Dungeons and Dragons. So it's like it came full circle.
Yeah. It's really cool how it was sort of, I would say, rescued by probably one of the first generations that grew up with the original game.
Yeah, that's pretty much what, and another little fact, I don't know how 100% true it is, because in prepping for this episode, I read things from, Wikipedia, a couple other articles I found, and I watched a bunch of really great videos on YouTube. And if you're more interested in some, like, a deeper dive into Dungeons and Dragons, I highly recommend going on YouTube and just typing in History of Dungeons and Dragons. There's several great, really good videos on that I watched. And here at Around the Tavern, I plan to do an even deeper dive into the history in a longer video format on our channel on YouTube. So if you're interested in that, definitely go over, head that way, and be prepared to check that out. Right, Steven?
I can't wait.
Yeah, Steven cannot wait.
I've learned something new. It's been so long. I can't wait to learn something new again.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Your brain's probably at max capacity right now.
Oh my gosh! It's
all this information.
It's engorged.
And let me just go ahead and state that this is a very light touch on the history of Dungeons and Dragons. There's a whole lot of drama, craziness, and there was a lot of inspiration that went into D&D, from war games to Lord of the Rings to where the company went, to where the company went up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. There's a lot of history there that I did not cover today. But let's kind of like backtrack a little bit, Stephen. In 1980s, what happened there, buddy?
I was born.
Ooh, okay.
Most important thing that happened.
Yeah, let's go ahead and write that down. Stephen was born somewhere in the 1980s. That's the most important thing. Outside of your birth, Stephen, what else happened in the 80s?
The Berlin Wall fell, I think. In 89.
Okay, Stephen, you're going to be that really annoying kid in class that the teacher's like wants to strangle but obviously can't. Stephen,
I'm naming things that happened in the 80s.
Let me rephrase the question, Stephen, kind of remind you what we are doing here. What happened in the 80s revolving around Dungeons and Dragons?
All right, well, second edition came out. No, I think the first edition came out in the 80s.
All right. Let's ignore Steven for a minute. In the 80s, there was a real big problem that's referred to as the Satanic Panic. And that's kind of when a lot of people, became really fearful of, anything that portrayed satanic or monsters or spells or magic, because they were really worried it's going to corrupt the children. Steven, did that impact you at all?
No, as we have discussed, I wasn't born really yet until the late 80s, so wasn't really too satanic as a child. But I can say, having parents who did live through the 80s and being born around that time, they were certainly influenced by the media and their opinion of the kinds of people who associate with fantasy role-playing games. Those are the kinds of people who worship the devil. And I don't know if any of our listeners know anything about Deep South America, but it is nothing if not religious and a little backwards.
Yes, hyper religious. And I remember going to school around here, parents still wouldn't let people watch like Harry Potter movies because there was magic. I even had a friend that wasn't allowed to watch SpongeBob because that was satanic for some reason, but I digress. There's a lot of deep-rooted beliefs, especially here in the South, that impacted Dungeons and Dragons and how people saw the game within, especially America, because something I learned during my research is, the satanic panic kind of really affecting D&D only happened in America, because I was reading a bunch of things on Reddit that we'll get into in a minute of people telling actual stories from, being alive in the 80s and playing the game in the 80s. It only happened in America. And maybe that's a little bit of, kind of an eye-opener for me that, being born here in America, not everything happens here affects the rest of the world,
I mean, USA number one, first of all, but yes, you're right. I mean, it is. I mean, it's hard to think of anywhere where you are not being the center of attention, and I mean, in America, we've gone through like several of these moral panics. I think in like the 50s, there was a big who did it about comic books being terrible for kids. So like you can see there was a big changeover in kind of like the kinds of stories and things that they were allowed to show in the comic media. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, the 90s, they were all like, oh, violent video games. That's the real problem, you guys. It's not bad parenting. It's violent video games.
So basically, America has a problem of using media as a scapegoat for not being good parents.
Yeah.
Got it. And, and another thing that kind of inflated this whole, panic in the 80s is media covering serial killers in the late 70s and 80s. This was kind of a new thing, like mass media, the news outlets, and they kind of realized, hey, if we cover these horrible, horrible crimes, people will tune in and watch it. So that's exactly what they did, and it kind of created this deep-rooted, like, unsettling ease within a lot of people. And there were a couple cases where people who were linked to playing D&D either killed themselves or committed horrible crimes, and people were like, hey, it's because they play that devil game. And that was kind of what started the basis of this fear. And it just kind of got upplayed by the media, which is something that still happens even today. And like I was saying, I did a lot of research. I was on the Dungeons and Dragons subreddit for this question that somebody posted: what stories do you have of the satanic panic? Here are a few of them that I really enjoyed. The first one, are you ready, Stephen? Are you listening?
All right. Number one, go.
It was 1985. I was at a bookstore buying a D&D book. While standing in line with my dad, a woman said to us, "You know that game is straight from Satan." And my dad said, "What do you mean?" She replied with, "The spells that it teaches you can summon real demons and take over your son's mind." And without missing a beat, my dad said, Do you think this demon will need to be reminded to clean up his room?"
Oh, Dad.
Oh, Dad moment. At least this dad was still being supportive in the time that everybody was like freaking out about it. So that was the first story that I enjoyed. Here's the second one. And not all of these stories will end with a laugh, Stephen. My cousin introduced me to D&D in 1983. I was 13, and I asked for a starter box for Christmas. My mom tells me the story of sitting in a coffee shop at the mall, agonizing over buying it for me after hearing the terrible things about it in the media. Luckily, she did. So, this is still, what I already mentioned. The media is really hyping up these parents saying, hey, it's this game. They're going to turn your kids into murderers or make them summon demons. And, it was a real thing that happened. And that's kind of like a prime example of a kid wanting to get into it. And then his mom was like, I don't know. Should I? Now, the third one, Stephen. When I was in high school, I always had to play a cleric because girls were not supposed to be fighters or mages. I loaned my player handbook and monster manual and that starter set to a classmate who wanted to get into playing D&D. He went off to a Christian summer camp, and when he came home, he told me that his family burned my books, my box set, and that he said that I was lucky that he saved me. So basically, this girl was really big into playing D&D and loaned it to a friend and their family burned everything and basically was like, you're lucky we saved you.
Yeah, their family sounds like they would have burned her too if they had known.
Yeah, it's like, if you brought that girl over here, we'd burn her at the stake, son.
But also, who is this friend getting caught with contraband that they borrowed from another friend?
Well, it kind of implies that, he gave it to his family to burn, and then like he went to the Christian summer camp and they convinced him that D&D was bad, and he was like, listen, I'm your friend, I saved you.
Huh. All right, well, a quick lesson for our listeners, all 12 of you. If you have a friend who is in favor of censorship or, burning of supposedly, bad media, I would find a different friend.
Yeah, and another point, don't let people borrow your stuff.
Yeah, never lend books to people. That's the second point.
That's the lesson to be learned. Don't be a good friend. Keep your stuff to yourself. And now here's another story, Stephen. It's funny in a bad way. Not my story, but my grandma and my dad's. My dad was in high school and my grandma was called to the office because his teacher thought my dad was planning to kill her because he let it slip that he played D&D. It's one of my grandma's favorite stories to tell. So basically, this kid's telling a story that his dad's teacher thought he was going to become a serial killer because he accidentally said he played the game.
It's like that time. Yeah. It's like that time I watched The Simpsons. I'm now a despotic dictator. I've killed hundreds of people.
Oh. Good job, Steve. Actually, that's kind of why, before we started openly talking about D&D at work, I was very hesitant to even say that I played D&D because there's still almost a weird connotation or a weird vibe to people who still play D&D here in the South, Well, it's just unfortunate because a lot of people care about football, or that's the right thing to be nerdy about, football and cars. Yeah, sorry.
Being nerdy about wizards and magical swords doesn't quite fit with the culture, I don't think.
And I've got two more Reddit stories for you, Stephen.
Ooh.
This one it's kind of weird because they were still allowed to play the game. They just had rules. A friend of mine was allowed to play D&D with us, but wasn't allowed to play any characters with magic because his mom thought it was satanic. So he usually played a chaotic neutral berserker. So basically his parents were like, yeah, you can play the game, just don't use any magic.
Nobody's ever murdered someone with an axe.
Yeah, Stephen. It kind of plays into that whole idea that people genuinely thought spells and games were this kind of secret way to get kids to learn ways to summon demons,
Uh-huh.
And here for the last story, and this one's a little bit more modern. It's because it's from 2001. Around 2001, I got my then girlfriend into D&D. Her mother became so worried that she made an appointment for us to go talk to her pastor. When my mom brought up the reason for us being there, he goes, "Oh, I used to play too." So the mom goes out of her way to hey, my kids are playing a bad game. Can you help save them? And then the pastor goes, "Oh, yeah, I play." And, for me personally, when I got into D&D, it was high school. And I remember bringing it up to my mom. And my mom was kind of born 1980, something like that, maybe 79. 79 sounds right. So my mom kind of grew up in the 80s too. And I told her, I was like, "Hey, Mom, I've started playing D&D with my friends." And she goes, no, you can't play that because you're going to get the Ouija board and you're going to start summoning demons. And I was like, "What? Mom, I'm a sorcerer. I can catch the forest on fire." And she goes, "You're summoning things with the Ouija board?" And I was like, "No, Mom, that's not how it works." But she's fully convinced that D&D is a way to summon demons because that's what she grew up hearing.
I don't know about you, but that makes D&D sound about 1,000 times cooler than it actually is.
Yeah. And I was like, "Man, Mom, I wish that's how the game was played."
If I had known reading all of the entire Harry Potter series was going to teach me any real practical magic, I would read it again in a heartbeat.
Yeah, how many times do I have to read the player handbook before I can cast Fireball in real life? And even to this day, my mom still gets very flinchy when I tell her that I play D&D or if I do anything Dungeons and Dragons related. She just part of her genuinely wholeheartedly believes it's a way to practice dark magic and summon bad demons, and I can't convince her otherwise. And here I am making a podcast about D&D.
Well, it's also strange because I imagine a vast majority of games involve combating those types of evil entities in the game.
And so, kind of to bring up a real good point about that, Steven, TSR during the 80s, they were like, hey, this game is about being the good guy and fighting off the evil things. So it's like about teaching your kids to fight the evil, not be the evil. And they went on this, TSR went on this whole campaign in the 80s to try to like tone down the horrible things the media and people were thinking about Dungeons and Dragons. And it worked to an extent, but it really took Wizards of the Coast in the early 2000s to kind of grab the game, rebrand it, remarket it into what we have now. And, you know, some of that still lingers. And I was reading in the subreddit, and if you guys listening are interested, like I said, I found all this in the Dungeons and Dragons subreddit, and the question was, what stories do you have of the Satanic Panic? And the ones, there were people who were like alive in the 80s, like young adult or, you know, young teenagers in the 80s playing, and they're like, hey, from the UK here, are you Americans okay? We didn't have that. And there were a couple of those, and Canada a little bit. So some of the players in Canada at the time, they were aware of what was going on in America, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. Like I recall reading this one story where a kid was like, yeah, I ran into my teacher, told my teacher I played, and they're like, cool, Sonny, cast that fireball, you know?
Well, that's just the problem with having so much of our God-given freedom, is that
America.
that includes the freedom to make terrible choices and ruin people's day.
And the freak out about everything. But that kind of wraps up our big topic of the day, Stephen. A deep dive into Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Documentaries.
Dun, dun,
I hope you guys enjoyed listening to that. And, you know, like I said, most of my research came from a couple articles, YouTube videos, and Wikipedia. So if I was wrong on something, please don't hold it against me. I'm trying my best. Okay.
No. Get in the comments. I want to see us get roasted for all of our inaccuracies.
Yeah. Go ahead and tell us how wrong we are. And this kind of leads us into a segment for this episode called Let Me Get Away With This, where I bring up a ridiculous idea to do in-game, and Steven decides if I'm going to be able to get away with it. Steven, are you ready for my ridiculous idea? Are you ready to tell me no, Steven?
I'm always ready to say the word no.
That's Steven. Steven has a vocabulary list of about 10 words, and the first 5 are no. So, Steven, my ridiculous idea today. So, you know, in 5th edition, an artificer can duplicate a magical item, right?
That sounds like the kind of kooky shit they gave artificers the ability to do.
So yes, artificers, and I'm kind of dumbing this down a little bit, artificers can infuse an item to basically be another magical item, and one of those items, a bag of holding. You can only do this once, so I'm going to need at least 2 other artificers in the party. There's 3 of us artificers duplicating bags of holding. So we've got the original bag of holding, my bag of holding, and then 2 additional bags of holding. We're going to take all 4, line them up on a table, and then we're either going to use like a homunculus or like a summoned animal or something to push all 4 together into each other at the same time. My goal is to make one massive astral gate. Am I going to get away with it?
So Chris is talking about a rather kind of obscure happenstance in Dungeons and Dragons, in which if you put an extra dimensional container within another extra dimensional container, I think in 5th edition there's a random table of what happens, but most of the time it's like, portal to the astral plane, everything goes bye-bye.
But my goal is to make a massive one. So is it going to make a massive one, or is it going to be 4 different things from the table, or is it just kind of probably fail? Like, you're the DM here, so you have final say.
I'm the DM here. It's me, my decision. So you're putting a bag within a bag. I'm not sure how quickly this homunculus is moving. I think
it's like if you had it lined up on a table, Steven, and you just shoved your fist continuously, and they kind of like all within the same half second went into each other. So it's fine if we're sacrificing this homunculus or like summoned animal. We don't really care about it. We're just trying to watch what happens.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if you said you wanted it to be what was the word you used?
Massive astral.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, if you're gonna get a party, first of all, that contains 3 artificers.
yeah.
Pretty narrow focus. And then you're going to, well, I guess with artificers in their case, they're not wasting any resources by creating these items. But if you're going to willingly strand yourself in the astral plane, sure, because I would not additively compound the effect. I would multiplicatively. So imagine whatever the size. I'm pretty sure it's like something like a 20-foot radius. Imagine 20 feet to the 4th power. Now it's a tens of thousands of feet wide. You could encompass an entire city block.
So we're definitely taking out a town or two with this, but you're letting me get away with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Chris. If you want to be adrift in the astral sea, derailing whatever storyline is currently happening, you go right ahead there, buddy. That's the whole point of the game.
You don't think that we could get far enough away that we could watch from a nice mountaintop with a spyglass and watch the homunculus just devastate an entire town or something?
No. I do not think that you would properly assess the threat that you are creating. And you would say, oh, let's get like 120 feet away. We won't be anywhere near the epicenter. No, you'd be very close.
So we get away with it, but we get like engulfed in the entire gate and the explosion and everything too. So I'm gonna take that as a win. I didn't think you were gonna let me get away with it, but I get away with it regardless of the end outcome. That's a win.
I think in the past I've come out against these sorts of shenanigans, but it really is always best if your players are trying to do something weird and wacky. If they think it's fun, then I think it's usually best to let them get away with it, but throw some sort of unimaginable consequence at them.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to check this first, let me get away with it, with a big old check mark. That's a win in my book. I'm good with it. So I wasn't expecting to get away with it. This is the best thing ever. I'm so happy right now.
And this is a win-win scenario because now I get to plan a whole astral adventure.
Yeah, this is just a whole plug to start playing Spelljammer.
Yeah.
It's perfect. And so let's jump into the next topic here, the next segment for today. We've got our every episode topic of a Reddit question, a question that I find on Reddit and I present to you for you to use your DM knowledge and experience to kind of give an answer. And the question I found today on Reddit asked, in 5th edition, can a vampire enter a tent if not invited? Because vampires in 5th edition, they have to be invited to enter a residence.
Okay.
So can they enter a tent?
So I think first you would have to look at the laws of what area they're in order to determine what length of time living in a structure is required to establish residency.
So you would have to know.
I think here in America, I think it's I actually have no idea. I'm guessing it would be at least a year. So if someone is dedicated enough to spend a year sleeping in a tent, which many people do, you could absolutely claim that tent is, without your permission, inaccessible to vampires. Now, the fun thing about tents is you can just set them on fire. So I don't know if that would necessarily prevent the vampire from doing anything.
Well, just could you imagine like a vampire like showing up and you've got the little window flap down, like unzipped, and he's just staring at you, and you go, "You can't enter my home," and he's like, "Oh no, my plans have been foiled." You know?
I summon 2d6 swarms of bats, and they swarm into your tent and devour you whole. Whoops.
So Steven's answer to this Reddit question of can a vampire in 5th edition enter a tent if not invited? Your answer is no, as long as the tent's already been established as a residence of that person or player. So if it was like you're walking down the road and your party stops for the night, sets up a tent, the vampire can enter that, right, Steven?
I'm gonna say absolutely.
Or what if it's the tent that you live in, you're just traveling with it, so it's still your house. So like you've had this tent your entire life. This is your house. You just set it in a different location.
Well, by that logic, I could simply hold a book over my head and claim residency of that book.
Well, then the vampire can't get in the book, Steven.
I'm saying no, Chris. Unless you are
okay.
permanently, I will say, living within a tent structure. It does not count as a residence, and therefore a vampire could enter or leave at its own will.
All right, there's our official verdict on this episode's Reddit question. Now, Steven, your favorite part's next. Can you guess what's next, Steven? Can you?
It's the boss battle.
Steven's boss battle. Brr, 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 brr. All right, Steven, I hope you're excited and ready for today's boss battle, because I know that I am.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm ready too.
Take it away, son. Take it.
All right, so
it's all yours.
We're talking about the history of Dungeons and Dragons. Christopher, what would you say would be the quintessential monster of the game Dungeons and Dragons?
Ooh, okay, so
now think really hard. You're gonna have to use your context clues of the game called Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The most iconic.
The answer is probably dragon, but I'm not gonna lie. I thought of like the Beholder or the gelatinous cube, because those are kind of like some of my favorite, like well-known monsters. I mean, that even people who don't play.
That would have been a good guess.
I'm guessing you're going to say dragon.
Actually, it was the gelatinous cube.
What? It's not a dragon.
No, it was dragon.
You were setting. Wait, what?
It was dragons. You were right, Chris. You're so clever. So yeah.
No, I think I'm so gullible.
Dragons are the boss battle for this week. In many games, I could certainly be accused of using dragons as plot device NPCs too often. In 5th edition, at least, all chromatic dragons, I think of at least adult age and up, can transform into basically a humanoid version of themselves. For me, in the cosmology of my homebrew world, that extends to all dragons of any color or metallic sheen. So very often I will plop a dragon in humanoid form to be, an important NPC. Currently in one of my games, there is a time-traveling dragon wizard who is pretty integral to the plot and helping the NPCs navigate through, traveling through time, since that isn't something that they can necessarily do themselves. But I'm not talking about that dragon. Right now I'm talking about a different dragon in the same game. This dragon has dedicated itself to the service of, let's call it it that consumes. Basically, the primal isn't the right word. I guess the fundamental element of existence that is decay, destruction, and the unmaking of things. And so this dragon, in the pursuit of that, has assembled to itself a coterie of bullywugs, that is evil, vile frog people that are all about, they're all about excess of consumption. They're all about sadistic pleasure and malevolence. And he has established for himself this sort of like miniature kingdom in a temple dedicated to destruction and decay. And he is basically, instead of hoarding treasure, as dragons are wont to do, this dragon has instead hoarded biological matter that is consumed. And the very nature of this existence-ending entity that it worships is such that it is rewarded this dragon with the gift of, unparalleled consumption. So imagine one thing that I don't super like about dragons in 5th edition is that their breath weapon is so key to their ability to deal damage to anything. And I don't know if any of our listeners have ever gone up against a seriously threatening dragon, but one bad breath weapon can take out your entire or half of your party, and that's just a real not fun time sometimes. So imagine a dragon that its breath weapon, and this is the black dragon, by the way, my favorite color of dragons. And this dragon, its breath weapon, which would usually be a stream of acid, is instead its ability to disgorge these consuming blobs. Like, imagine if, like, every turn this dragon could just, like, burp forth, like, ochre jellies or black puddings. These, like, creatures that don't really have a will. All they do is touch and destroy. And this dragon, it would be focused in combat on grappling creatures so that it could ingest them, so that it could create more devouring slimes. This dragon, as the fight goes on, you'll see that the wounds begin to ooze all of this devouring, substance. So a dragon that is maybe less focused on, conquest or tyranny, which is kind of the MO of most dragons, but a dragon that is focused purely on destruction.
Wow.
Yeah. That's my boss battle for the week.
Okay, I think I'm gonna be real here. Honestly, I could solo that dragon.
Oh, really? I'm gonna no veto. I got to say no anyway.
So actually, fun fact here: I've never fought a dragon in Dungeons and Dragons, and I know that's like, what are you doing, Chris? I don't know. Ask my dungeon masters. They've never put a dragon in my path. I've never fought a dragon, and it's kind of sad now that I think about it as a single tear sheds from my eyeball.
Well, I think a lot of the times dragons are kind of wasted. You shouldn't ever just be walking down a hallway and, oh, there's a dragon. Oh, well, you're fighting a dragon now. A dragon should be an important part of the story somehow, and deciding to fight a dragon should be like, okay, we've gone on multiple adventures to prepare ourselves for this encounter.
Yeah. Well, actually, in the earlier editions, it was quite literally the title, Stephen. You would go into a dungeon to fight a dragon, and maybe that's why it became so cliched to like have a dragon in your campaign or as the boss, and that's maybe why I've never had a DM use a dragon as the big bad evil guy or the big boss or anything like that. So, Stephen, who is also one of my DMs, please incorporate a dragon.
All right. Well, we're currently running a game in feudal Japan, so you can be sure you will encounter at least some form of dragon in the future.
Oh, yeah. Well, Stephen, I enjoyed your boss battle today. It was wonderful. And I hope you guys have enjoyed everything we've talked about, from our big topic, the deep dive into Dungeons and Dragons, then to, our Reddit question, Chris's Can You Get Away With It, and Steven's big boss battle. And we've got a fun thing at the end of this episode that'll kind of play as like an additional add-on. It will be one of the interviews for the contest. Today, I will have the interview that I did with my buddy Chance and his character. And that is definitely something that I enjoyed that interview, and he had a great character, and I hope you guys will enjoy listening to that. Stephen, I know you're going to have to listen to it eventually, because we're going to pick our winner for Around the Tavern contest characters that should have been.
Yeah, I am going to have to listen to it sometime.
So buckle up, everybody, for that interview. It's definitely a fun one. And just kind of reiterate that contest there. It's characters that should have been a contest where people present characters they made, but they never got to play. And I've interviewed 6 different people, and those interviews will And those interviews will be added on to the end of our shows, episodes 2 through 7. And me and Steven will pick our favorite and announce them as the very first ever winner of the Around the Tavern Award. And it's something I'm looking forward to. The interviews are going well, and I've really enjoyed everybody I've interviewed so far. So it's definitely something you should look forward to if you're one of our listeners. And all of this content will also be uploaded separately to YouTube once we finish the series. So if you enjoyed a specific interview, you'll be able to go to our YouTube channel and watch the audio of just that interview if you would like. And Steven, do you have anything to add here to wrap up this episode?
Whew, I hope you're all having a great day.
Oh, look at that, Steven having a wholesome moment. But as always, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for joining us here in our tavern. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. And here's that interview for you. Welcome to the very first episode of Characters That Should Have Been, a contest series where people introduce characters they've made but they've never played. Today, I've got one of my good friends, Chance. Chance, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, so like I've already explained, this is a contest where you bring a character you've made but you never got to play. How long have you been playing Dungeons and Dragons?
I've been playing for about 6 years now.
Yeah, what kind of got you into the game?
We just kind of started playing in high school. We didn't really have that much to do, and we figured it'd be a fun little pastime.
Yeah, I kind of started just before high school, and it's led up to the point where we've played now in college. Are you more of a player, or do you dungeon master more?
I definitely DM more than I play now. I used to. It was the other way around.
So let me go ahead and hear about your character. What's your character's name?
He's a tiefling wanderer, so he kind of starts out with a couple different names. His birth name is Samandriel Creed, kind of going for that old like Western style name, because the theme of it is he's a wandering snake oil salesman.
So what kind of maybe inspired you to make that character?
Oh, well, to tell you the truth, me and my friends, I had one friend who was planning on doing a Western-themed campaign. It never happened, but I kind of got stuck. You know the old, like, story about meeting a devil at the crossroads to make a deal? Yeah. Basically, I was like, why don't I make that for the campaign setting to be my character, is the devil.
Oh, I mean, that's definitely an interesting concept, and it was inspired because it was a Western theme. Do you want to dive into the backstory a little bit, kind of giving us the tragic backstory most D&D characters have?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He was born in a sort of dusty town to a cult called the Brides of Calamity, which were a bunch of other tieflings of the bloodline of Despater who were trying to bring about the resurrection of a demon called Ertu. And because he was raised up in that cult, he kind of has a skewed view on religion.
Yeah, most cults will do that to you.
Yeah, most cults will. Yeah, you would think so.
Been there, done that. You know how that goes.
Yeah. Other than that, his mother was a loving mother, but like a devout cultist.
Yeah, I mean, at least she was a loving mother.
Yeah, and it just so happened that at one point he decided that the cult had these missions that they would go out and they'd go and recruit people to bring them back to the city where they'd pretend to be wandering salesmen. And he was like, I'm going to do that, but I'm just not going to come back.
I mean, that sounds like a very solid idea. Mm-hmm. Take the concept and then just leave.
Yeah. He basically, he's not like he doesn't plan on returning eventually. He just wants to travel and do his own thing, mainly to make money.
Oh, okay. So you'd maybe describe him as a little bit of a greedy little lad.
Oh, he's definitely greedy. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And what kind of gave you the idea to be a snake oil salesman? Is there any kind of inspiration behind that, or was that the first thing you thought of?
Well, when I first started drawing up the character, coming up with the idea, my original thought was to make him more snake-like as a tiefling, like give him a forked tongue and slitted eyes. But I ended up moving away from that idea because, people wouldn't be very trusting to that kind of folk on the road.
I don't know, if I saw a little lad and he's like, hey, you want to come buy my oils? And then like his tongue slithered out at me, I would instantly trust him. He has my full trust.
Yeah, I'm sure there would be some people who would be into that kind of thing, but I was aiming for more of a old Southern charmer type thing.
So, he's walking through a town and he's going to knock up on a door like, knock, 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 knock. Hello there.
Yeah, it's like, oh, hello there, miss. Would you like to buy some of my wares? Stuff like that.
It's totally a shame that you never got the chance to play this character, but at least you've had this opportunity to kind of shed some more light and bring your traveling snake oil salesman to life. A few more questions before we wrap up this interview. What would you say is your main, character fallback? Like, do you usually go with a bard or...
no, this was actually
kind of a tiefling.
This was going to be this would be my first tiefling and my first bard. That's why I wanted to play it so bad.
So you're definitely trying to branch out a little bit there.
Yeah, I've never played a tiefling or a bard, and this particular, it was going to be a bard of spirits. So they were going to be focused less on using music and more on telling stories. And collecting stories. Like they would collect stories on their travels and kind of use that to communicate with the spirits of the damned.
So just to be a real good con man.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that he has different names. Can we hear a few of those different names?
Yeah, the traveling salesman name is he actually goes by the name of Sammy Crossroads. Because it's he actually grew up in the cult itself. None of them used their birth names because they all believe that if you know somebody's name, you have power over them.
Your standard cult stuff.
Yeah, your standard cult stuff. One of his quirks is if somebody knows his real name, he'll actually follow whatever order they'll give to him. So long as it doesn't cause direct harm to himself.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing to add to your character. That's a feature I like to add to some of my characters, is kind of give them a weakness or some kind of drawback. It kind of makes the role play element a little bit more engaging, in my opinion.
I definitely think so. It makes it more entertaining for me as the player, and for the DM too. It adds. Well, of course, you want to let them in on it so they know they can play around with it somewhere.
Yeah, and is there anything else you would like to share about your character? Kind of let people know more about old Sammy Crossroad?
Well, I suppose there's a couple things. I kind of would like to dive in. This was going to be my first truly, evil character. Because the whole concept was when we were building our party is that everybody else in the party was supposed to be good. We didn't even have a rogue or anything in the party. We didn't even have a thief or anything like that. So he was supposed to be kind of a driving evil, something whispering in the rest of the party's ear to convince them to go the exact opposite way. So his the party dynamic, we actually did do a session 0 for building the characters themselves. But we never actually got to play, which is a shame. But the party dynamic is they had a cleric and a paladin, and he absolutely despises paladins. He doesn't have a problem with clerics.
It's just those big old brooding paladin kind of guys. They're too good for his taste.
Yes, he despises the idea of them. He himself is forced to keep his promises because he believes that if he doesn't keep his promise, he's worthless as that kind of devil creature that he doesn't believe himself to be a tiefling. He actually believes himself to be a creature of the infernal, because that's what the cult raised him up to believe, is that he's actually from hell.
Okay, right on.
So he believes that he's forced to keep all of his promises, otherwise something bad will befall him. So the idea that somebody would willingly take an oath disgusts them.
Oh, so basically because he was created to be this, he doesn't like the idea that other people choose to do things.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, I like that concept. That would definitely make for an interesting party dynamic.
I thought so. It's a shame, though. It'll never happen.
It's a real shame. At least you can take old Sammy here, tuck him neatly in a folder, and save him for one day.
Eventually.
One long day. And I will say that the whole time you've been describing your character to me, the only thing that's popped up in my head, you know the movie Rango?
Yeah.
That snake cowboy? That is all I've pictured.
I do love that movie. I have watched that movie quite often.
Yeah, it's that snake with the cowboy hat and the machine gun as the rattling tail.
Yeah, I tip my hat one legend to another. I know what you're talking about. Classical.
Well, Chance, I definitely appreciate you coming and joining us here on the interview, the contest here on Around the Tavern. You're going to be on episode 2 because you're our first interview for the entire contest. And once everyone gets in, we're going to review all the information. And I wish you the best of luck on winning our contest. But we'll have to see what else we hear because I don't know the other characters yet.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you guys for joining us here at Around the Tavern. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, our big topic of the week. And once again, thank you, Chance, for joining us. We'll see you guys next time.